Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Our Jewish tradition contains infinite tenderness, beauty, and grace. The divine presence that enters our homes and our synagogues at sundown on Shabbat. The enfolding love of a Yiddish lullaby. The dove returning to Noah with the olive leaf in its beak. Magical folk tales from Yemen and Persia and Poland and Morocco. Small children licking Hebrew letters written in honey so that the words of Torah would be sweet in their mouth. The erotic love poetry of Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. The vast ocean of the Talmud and the fiery mysteries of the Kabbalah. Infinite beauty, infinite grace, infinite love. There is also in our memory deep trauma, profound suffering, the burning of Jerusalem, children torn from their parents' arms during long nights of terror, Cossacks, Crusaders, Nazis, now Hamas, murdering, raping, and torturing Jewish women, elderly Jews, Jewish children. Somehow all of this horror is stored up in our minds together with all of the beauty and all of the love. It seems impossible that such wildly different memories and ideas and feelings could coexist in our consciousness without tearing our minds to pieces. But somehow they all coexist together inside of us. No wonder our hearts are aching. In the Torah this week, we find ourselves in Egypt, in the heart of darkness. The night of the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn Egyptians. This is the story that we relive every year at our Passover Seder. In fact, the Torah text itself pauses at the dramatic climax of the story just before the final plague begins. The story freezes, and the voice of God speaks to us of the distant future in which the descendants of the Israelites will gather for a festival and will tell the story over a ritual meal. Children will ask their parents, "What is this? Why are we doing this?" And their parents will respond with, "This is the Passover sacrifice to our God, who struck down the Egyptians, but who passed over our houses and saved us." The voice of God speaks to us in this portion about our own storytelling, our own attempt to awaken the curiosity of our children. The way we use matzah and horseradish and parsley and salt water to capture their attention, to make them notice that something is different. And God speaks in this portion saying, "When your children shall say to you, 'What does this ritual mean?' In that magic moment, when a child asks a real question, then a new link is forged in the ancient unbroken chain of love and tradition. Side by side with this 3,000-year-old story of storytelling and question asking and eating and singing under the full moon of springtime, just 5 verses later, we read of unbearable suffering. The death of countless innocent children. The firstborn, even of the slave girl who is behind the millstones. And the firstborn even of the captive who is in prison. In one night, thousands upon thousands of children die. Children who have not beaten a slave. Children who have done nothing wrong. The Torah makes certain twice to inform us that even the firstborn of those with no power, the slave girl, the captive in prison, even their firstborn die. And the Torah describes the cry that was heard that night. A great cry went out throughout the land of Egypt, the like of which had never been heard, and the like of which shall never be heard again. The Torah demands that we hear that cry. Strangely, the Torah expresses no sorrow, no pity for all those children or their powerless mothers and fathers. The Torah describes the cry in all of its heartbroken misery, but offers no word of regret or apology or of sympathy. That terrible cry went forth and will be remembered forever as the unforgettable sound of the Passover night. The Torah does not love that cry. It does not celebrate the great and terrible cry of Egypt, but neither does it sympathize with it. It almost feels as though the heart of the Torah has grown hard, like Pharaoh. But the Torah demands that we hear that cry. Later Jewish readers of the text, hundreds and thousands of years after it was written, were troubled. If anybody in the second row is having trouble keeping quiet, you'll have to step out, okay? Just totally quiet right now, okay? Great. Later Jewish readers of the text, hundreds and thousands of years later, were troubled by the death of the innocent children in Egypt. One classic midrash, a legend in response to the Torah text, offers a justification. Why was the firstborn of the slave girl punished? Asks Midrash Tanchuma, and the midrash answers, because they had rejoiced when Pharaoh decreed the genocide against Israel. The slave girl and the captive did not physically harm the Israelites. They were themselves at the bottom of the Egyptian social hierarchy. But the Midrash says they rejoiced. They sang when they heard the Pharaoh enslaving the Israelites. They laughed and they danced when they heard that Israelite babies were being thrown into the river. And because they rejoiced, says the Midrash, the slave girl and the captive suffered seeing their own firstborn children die. That is one version of what happened. But that is not the way the Torah tells the story. The Torah does not try to defend or to explain or to justify or even to understand the death of the Egyptian children. It just wants us to pay attention, to listen to the crying. As we hear the news from Gaza every day, our hearts are pummeled constantly by the crying. The traumatized children, the wailing mothers, the grief-stricken fathers. What should we do? Do we follow the path of the Midrash and explain that those children rejoiced following October 7th, celebrating Hamas's brutally sadistic pogrom? Perhaps they did celebrate. Can we honestly say that that justifies their death? I would say this. Hamas started this war. And in war, civilians die. Children are dying, and I blame Hamas. But this does not answer the question, what do we do about the crying? Do we harden our hearts in defense of our own sanity and refuse to look and refuse to hear the crying from Gaza? Or do we open our eyes and our ears and our minds to all of the suffering in both Israel and in Gaza, the hunger and the cold, the catastrophic injuries, the abject fear, and all the death. Can we hold all of that pain in our hearts and not be driven to despair? Just a few days after October 7th, Marian and I attended a concert of the Santa Barbara Symphony, conducted by Maestro Nir Cabaretti. Before the orchestra, is just a couple of days after October 7th, and before the orchestra began to play, Nir shared with us the words of Leonard Bernstein from 1963, shortly after President Kennedy was assassinated. Bernstein said, "This will be our reply to violence. To make music more intensely, more beautifully, more devotedly than ever before." I believe that Leonard Bernstein was speaking in that dark hour of our human capacity to hold in our hearts and minds more than we imagined possible. Immense contradictions that seem like they must tear us apart, infinite suffering and infinite beauty, necessary self-defense and equally necessary compassion, war and also loving kindness, death and birth, despair and hope. In our Jewish memory, we have stored up both immeasurable pain and also infinite tenderness, beauty, and grace. One dark night in Egypt, over 3,000 years ago, we heard the terrible, unforgettable cry of suffering innocence. And in the very same instant, a nation of loving parents and children, question askers and storytellers began to be born. May we allow our own hearts to expand, to acknowledge all of the brokenness and all of the beauty of this, our only world. Shabbat Shalom.